Let me paint you a picture, and I need you to really sit with this one, because what I am about to describe is one of those moments in history that sounds like it was written for the movies, but was absolutely documented, verifiably real. It is the spring of 1945. Germany has collapsed. The most powerful military machine that continental Europe had ever assembled, the Wehrmacht, the force that had rolled through Poland in 3 weeks, through France in 6, that had driven deep into the Soviet Union and come within artillery range of Moscow, is broken. Its armies are surrendering in their hundreds of thousands. Its cities are rubble. Its government is dead, or hiding, or frantically burning documents in the final hours before the Americans and the Soviets close the ring completely. And in the middle of all of this, in some requisitioned building in the heart of defeated Germany, sitting across a table from American officers, is a German general. Not a broken man. Not a hollow-eyed, shell-shocked wreck begging for cigarettes and mercy and a guarantee that the Soviets won't get him. No, this man is something considerably more complicated and considerably more unsettling than that. He is sitting straight. His uniform, though worn, is correct. His posture is the posture of a man who has commanded armies across thousands of miles of the most savage battlefield in the history of human warfare, and who has not yet, not quite, not entirely internalized the fact that he lost. He has fought on the Eastern Front. He has survived things that most human beings cannot fully imagine from a comfortable distance: the frozen hell of the Russian steppe in winter, temperatures that killed engines and froze the oil in tank transmissions and turned the ground into iron that couldn't be dug for graves, battles of encirclement where entire German armies disappeared into the vastness of the Soviet interior like stones dropped into a dark ocean. He has watched the greatest military operation in human history, Operation Barbarossa. 3 million men on a 2,000-mile front transform from a campaign of rapid conquest into a grinding, catastrophic, years-long war of attrition that consumed the best of the German military generation and left behind a landscape of frozen corpses stretching from the suburbs of Moscow to the banks of the Volga. And now he is sitting across from Americans. And what he is saying calmly, analytically, with the detached professional authority of a man giving a military briefing rather than a defeated enemy accounting for his actions to the victorious power, is something that is making every American officer in that room feel a complicated, uncomfortable mixture of anger and uncertainty, and something they don't quite want to name, but that sits in the chest like a stone. He is saying that the Americans are the JV team. Not in those exact words. This is a German general in 1945, not a Twitter account, but in language that amounts to exactly the same thing. He is explaining, with charts and maps and the particular kind of exhausted, seen-it-all authority that only a man who has fought on the Eastern Front can authentically project, that the war the Americans fought, the campaign in North Africa, the landings in Sicily and Italy, the Normandy invasion, the drive across France, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine was, in terms of scale and ferocity, and the sheer industrial brutality of what it demanded from the men who fought it, a fundamentally different and fundamentally lesser order of magnitude than what happened on the Eastern Front. That the real war, the war that actually broke the Wehrmacht, that actually bled Germany white, that actually decided the fundamental question of whether Adolf Hitler's empire would stand or fall, was fought in the East, against the Red Army, in conditions that made everything the Americans experienced look, by comparison, almost manageable. And then, and this is the moment, this is the thing that makes every hair on the back of your neck stand up. He looks across that table, and sitting across that table, listening to every single word of this, with those pale, cold, extraordinarily dangerous eyes, and that particular loaded stillness that the men who served under him had learned to read the way sailors read weather, is George S. Patton, the most aggressive, most brilliant, most combustible American military commander of the entire Second World War. The man who turned an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of a brutal winter campaign and drove it 60 miles through ice and snow to relieve surrounded soldiers at Bastogne in a time frame his own staff called impossible. The man who crossed the Rhine so fast that Omar Bradley didn't believe the initial reports. The man who had driven his Third Army across more ground, against more resistance, in less time than almost any comparable force in the history of mechanized warfare. That man, listening to a German general tell him that what he and his soldiers had accomplished was the military equivalent of junior varsity. Now I want you to think about what happens next, because what Patton did, what he said, how he said it, the specific, devastating, historically documented response he delivered in that room was not what you would expect from a man famous for volcanic, profanity-laced explosions of temper. It was something considerably more sophisticated, considerably more dangerous, and considerably more revealing about who George Patton actually was as a military mind and as a human being than any simple outburst could have been. And we are going to walk through every inch of it tonight. But first, real quick, and I mean this, drop your location in the comments right now. Where are you watching from? Your city, your state, your country, because this community is something real and something special, and I genuinely want to know who is in the room with me tonight. And if this is your first time on this channel, brother, you just found your home. This is where history gets told the way it deserves to be told. Raw, dramatic, authentic. No textbook sanitizing. No footnote burying. Just the real stories of the real men who made the real world we are living in right now. Hit that subscribe button, because we do this every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Like this video if you are already locked in, and tell me in the comments, do you think the Germans had a legitimate point? Was the Eastern Front truly the decisive theater of World War II? Or is that argument itself a form of self-serving historical revisionism from a military that needed to explain away its own defeat? I want your honest, unfiltered take. Drop it below, because that debate is one of the most fascinating arguments in all of military history, and this community is the place to have it. Now let's go, because to understand what Patton said in that room, you first have to understand the argument being made against him. And to understand that argument, you have to understand something about the Eastern Front that most Americans, even Americans who think they know their World War II history pretty well, have genuinely never fully grasped, because the Eastern Front was not just a different theater of the same war. It was a different category of human experience altogether. And the numbers, the raw, staggering, almost incomprehensible numbers, are where we have to start. Because nothing else about this story makes sense until you have sat with those numbers long enough for them to actually land. The Soviet Union lost between 27 and 40 million people in World War II. The United States lost approximately 405,000 across all theaters combined. The single Battle of Stalingrad produced more combined casualties than the United States suffered in the entire war. The siege of Leningrad lasted 900 days and killed somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million civilians through starvation alone. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion launched in June 1941, was the largest military operation in human history, involving over 3 million soldiers on a front nearly 2,000 miles wide. It began more than a year before American soldiers fired their first shots at German forces anywhere. This is the landscape that the German general was standing on when he looked across the table at Patton and made his argument. And this is why that argument, infuriating, insulting, delivered with the arrogance of a defeated man who somehow hadn't fully absorbed his own defeat, could not simply be laughed off or dismissed. Because buried inside the arrogance was a question that serious military historians are still wrestling with today. And Patton knew it, which is exactly what made his response so extraordinary. Stay with me, because we are just getting warmed up. To understand why that German general felt confident enough or arrogant enough, depending on your perspective, to sit across from George Patton in the ruins of his defeated country and essentially grade the American military effort as insufficient, you have to understand something fundamental about the psychology of the Wehrmacht officer corps in 1945. And this is something that military historians have written about extensively, but that popular history tends to gloss over in favor of simpler narratives. Because the truth of it is complicated and uncomfortable in ways that resist easy packaging. The German professional military, the career officers, the general staff men, the products of a military tradition that traced its intellectual lineage through Clausewitz and Moltke and Schlieffen, had a relationship with their own defeat that was, to put it plainly, deeply, profoundly, psychologically strange. They had not lost, in their own internal accounting, because the American soldier was better than the German soldier. They had not lost because American generalship had outclassed German generalship at the operational and strategic level. They had not lost, in their view, because of any fundamental military inferiority on the part of the Wehrmacht or the men who led it. They had lost, and this was the narrative that was already crystallizing in German military circles even before the last shots were fired. The narrative that would eventually harden into what historians call the clean Wehrmacht myth and the stab-in-the-back revision of World War II, because of factors that were, in their telling, essentially external to the military itself. They had lost because Hitler had interfered with professional military judgment at critical moments, and this was true, genuinely and documentably true. Hitler's micromanagement of military operations had produced disasters like the halt order at Dunkirk and the catastrophic decisions at Stalingrad. They had lost because Germany had been fighting a two-front war against opponents with overwhelmingly superior industrial resources. And this was also true. The combined industrial output of the United States, the Soviet, and the British Empire dwarfed what Germany could produce, even at maximum mobilization. They had lost because they had been betrayed by allies, the Italians, the Hungarians, the Romanians, whose military performance on the Eastern Front had created the gaps through which Soviet forces had poured to encircle German armies at Stalingrad and elsewhere. All of these things contained genuine truth, and all of them were being assembled, in 1945, into a psychological defense mechanism of extraordinary sophistication, a way of processing catastrophic defeat that allowed the German officer corps to maintain, even in the rubble of everything they had fought for, a core sense of professional self-respect and military identity. And central to that psychological architecture was the Eastern Front, because if you were a German general in 1945, trying to make sense of what had just happened to you, the Eastern Front was your trump card. It was the thing that no one who had not been there could fully comprehend. It was the crucible that had consumed the best of the German military generation, in conditions of such extreme violence and privation that it existed in an almost separate moral and experiential category from everything else that had happened in the war. More than 800 Wehrmacht divisions had fought on the Eastern Front at various points. German casualties in the East, killed, wounded, captured, exceeded 4 million men. The distances involved were almost beyond comprehension for Western European military minds accustomed to thinking in hundreds of miles rather than thousands. The weather alone, the Russian winter, which had defeated Napoleon and which the German High Command had catastrophically underestimated, was a military factor of a kind that no American soldier fighting in Western Europe had ever faced in comparable form. And the Red Army by 1943, and certainly by 1944, had become something genuinely fearsome. Not just in its numbers, though the numbers were staggering, but in its operational sophistication, in the quality of commanders like Zhukov and Rokossovsky and Vasilevsky, who had learned from catastrophic early defeats and rebuilt the Soviet military into a force capable of conducting massive, multi-front offensive operations of extraordinary complexity and power. So when that German general sat across from Patton and began making his argument, he was drawing on all of this. He was saying, in essence, you Americans fought a clean war, a well-supplied war, a war where your logistics worked and your Air Force owned the sky, and your soldiers never had to eat their horses to survive, and your generals never had to shoot their own men to keep them from running. You fought in France and Belgium and the Rhineland places with roads and railways and towns with buildings still standing. You fought a Wehrmacht that was already badly depleted by 4 years of Eastern Front combat, that was running out of fuel and ammunition and trained replacements, that was being attacked simultaneously from the air by a force so overwhelming that moving tanks in daylight had become almost suicidal. You did not fight the Wehrmacht at its strength. You fought it at its end, and the German general did not stop there. Because this is the part that the history books almost never include the specific, operational, militarily detailed nature of the argument he was making. He talked about specific battles. He talked about the scale of armored engagements on the Eastern Front that dwarfed anything the Americans had experienced the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in history, involving over 6,000 armored vehicles on a front hundreds of miles wide. He talked about the operational depth of Soviet offensive operations, the massive encirclement battles, where entire German army groups were surrounded and destroyed, involving the movement of millions of men and thousands of vehicles across distances that made the Normandy campaign look like a local operation. He talked about the quality of Soviet anti-tank weapons and artillery that the Germans had faced in the East, weapons that had evolved through years of brutal trial and error into some of the most effective in the world. He was making, in other words, not just a psychological defense of German military honor. He was making a specific, detailed, operationally grounded military argument, and it was landing in the room with a weight that was making some of the American officers present visibly uncomfortable. Because the argument contained, wrapped in its arrogance, buried beneath its self-serving psychology, a kernel of genuine military truth that serious people could not simply wave away. And George Patton, sitting at the head of that table listening to every word of this with those pale eyes and that loaded silence, was too honest a military professional and too serious a student of war to pretend otherwise. He knew the Eastern Front numbers. He had studied them. He had read the operational reports, the order of battle analyses, the intelligence assessments of what the Red Army had accomplished between 1941 and 1945. He was not a man who dealt in comfortable illusions about military reality, not about his enemies, not about his allies, and not about himself or the forces under his command. So when he finally spoke, when that silence broke, and Patton began his response, it did not begin the way anyone in that room expected it to begin. It did not begin with anger. It did not begin with the theatrical, profanity-loaded explosion that was the Patton of popular legend. It began with something that was, in its own way, more startling than any outburst could have been. It began with agreement, partial, precise, carefully bounded agreement that made every American officer in the room blink and shift in their seats, because for a moment, just a moment, it sounded almost like Patton was conceding the point. And then the trap closed, because what Patton was doing, what became clear within 60 seconds of him beginning to speak, was not agreeing with the German general. He was doing something far more sophisticated. He was entering the German general's own argument, accepting its premises on the German general's own terms, and then with the methodical, devastating precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life studying the art of destroying an opponent's position, dismantling it from the inside. He started with the numbers. Yes, he said. The Eastern Front was larger. Yes, The casualties were incomprehensible. Yes, the Red Army had done something extraordinary in absorbing the initial German onslaught, rebuilding, and eventually driving the Wehrmacht back 2,000 miles to Berlin. He acknowledged all of that directly, without flinching, without diplomatic softening. And then he asked the German general a question. A single, quiet, precisely aimed question that landed in the room like a shaped charge designed not to make noise, but to collapse a specific structure from within. He asked the German general what he thought the American industrial contribution to the Eastern Front had been worth. And the German general paused. Because here is what that question was pointing at: something that the Eastern Front mythology, in its focus on the drama and the scale and the savagery of the fighting itself, consistently underplays to the point of almost disappearing entirely. The Soviet Union did not fight the Eastern Front alone. It fought it with American steel and American aluminum and American trucks and American food and American boots and American communications, equipment flowing in an unending river across the Atlantic and through the Persian corridor and the Pacific supply routes under the Lend-Lease program that the United States had been running since 1941. The numbers of what America sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease are staggering in their own right, and in a completely different way from the Eastern Front casualty figures. Nearly 400,000 trucks, nearly 14,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 15 million pairs of boots, enough food, canned meat, powdered eggs, concentrated rations to feed the Red Army for years. The Soviet logistical system, which had been catastrophically disrupted by the German invasion, and which the Soviet industrial base alone could never have fully reconstituted in time to support the massive offensive operations of 1943 and 1944, was kept functional in critical ways by American supply. Nikita Khrushchev, who was no friend of the United States and had every political incentive to minimize the American contribution, acknowledged after the war that without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union could not have continued the war. Georgy Zhukov, the greatest Soviet military commander of the war, a man not given to generosity toward anyone or anything, said privately that the Red Army could not have fed itself, could not have moved its forces with the speed and operational depth that produced its great victories, without American trucks and American food. Patton knew all of this. He had the numbers, he had the reports, and now, in that room, he laid them out in front of that German general with the calm, methodical precision of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has prepared for it with characteristic thoroughness, and the German general's confidence that straight-backed, Iron Cross-bearing, Eastern Front veteran's certainty that he was dealing with a junior partner who didn't fully understand the real war began, visibly, to waver. But Patton was not finished. Not even close. Because the numbers were just the opening move. What came next, the second phase of Patton's response, the part that went beyond logistics and supply and industrial contribution and cut directly to the military heart of the German general's argument, was something that nobody in that room saw coming, and it was something that, once said, could not be taken back and could not be answered. Stay with me, because we are right at the edge of the moment that makes this whole story unfold. Patton pulled his chair around. Not to the head of the table, not to a position of ceremonial authority, he pulled it directly across from the German general. Close enough that the two men were separated by perhaps 3 feet of air and 8 decades of military tradition, and the entire moral and historical weight of everything that had just happened to the world over the preceding 6 years. He sat down. He leaned forward, and he looked at that German general the way a chess grandmaster looks at a board when he has already seen the endgame and is simply working out how many moves it will take to get there. And then he began the second phase of what would become one of the most remarkable military arguments ever conducted between a victorious and a defeated commander in the immediate aftermath of a world war. He started with a question that seemed, on its surface, almost casual. He asked the German general which American unit he considered the most tactically sophisticated force the Wehrmacht had faced in the Western theater. Just that. Simple, direct, almost conversational. And the German general, still operating in the mode of the professional military briefer, still maintaining that posture of detached analytical authority, answered without apparent hesitation. He named the American armored divisions, specifically the formations of Patton's own Third Army. He described their operational tempo, the speed with which they moved, the flexibility with which they responded to changing battlefield conditions, the way they repressed combined arms tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, air support into a seamlessly integrated fighting system that had, he acknowledged, presented genuine tactical problems for the German forces opposing them. He said this the way a professor might acknowledge a student's correct answer, with a kind of measured, conditional approval that still managed to convey that the bar being cleared was not an especially high one. And Patton nodded, slowly, like a man who has just received exactly the answer he was looking for. And then he asked his second question. He asked the German general what the operational tempo of the Third Army's advance across France in the summer of 1944 had represented in terms of miles covered per day, per week, per month, and how that compared to the operational tempo of German armored advances during the high point of Wehrmacht performance on the Eastern Front. And this is where the German general's composure showed its first crack. Because the honest answer to that question, the answer that the operational records demanded, the answer that anyone who had actually studied the numbers rather than the mythology was forced to arrive at, was not comfortable for the narrative he had been constructing. The Third Army's breakout from Normandy and drive across France in August and September of 1944 was, by any serious operational measurement, one of the most rapid and sustained armored advances in the history of mechanized warfare. In the weeks following the breakout from St. Patton's forces covered ground at a rate that stunned even the most optimistic Allied planners. They crossed rivers that German commanders had expected to hold for weeks. They bypassed fortified positions that conventional military doctrine would have required them to reduce before advancing. They maintained their operational momentum through supply challenges that should, by conventional military logic, have forced them to pause and consolidate, and they did it through a combination of aggressive leadership at every level, extraordinary logistical improvisation, and the particular quality of the American soldier that Patton was about to spend considerable time to. The advance of Third Army across France covered approximately 500 miles in roughly 100 days, but the raw mileage understates what was actually accomplished, because those miles were covered against a resisting enemy across terrain that included major river obstacles, fortified towns, and the remains of a German military that, depleted and demoralized as it was, still had the training and the institutional reflexes to make every mile cost something. And Patton told the German general all of this, not boastfully, or rather, not only boastfully, which would have been easy to dismiss. He told it analytically, operationally, in the language of military staff work rather than personal pride. He cited specific engagements. He referenced specific crossing operations, the Moselle, the Meuse, the Rhine itself, and the speed with which Third Army engineers had thrown bridges across those obstacles under fire in time frames that had repeatedly caught German defenders flat-footed. He talked about the battle for the Falaise Pocket, the encirclement operation in Normandy, that had trapped and largely destroyed 2 German armies, and that had required the kind of rapid, flexible, multi-corps coordination that is extraordinarily difficult to execute, and that Third Army had executed with a speed and a decisiveness that left German commanders scrambling to respond. And then he pivoted, hard, into the thing that the German general had not seen coming and was not prepared for. He stopped talking about operations. He stopped talking about miles covered and rivers crossed and encirclements executed. He started talking about the men, the individual American soldiers The kids from Kansas and Ohio and Alabama and Brooklyn and rural Georgia and the south side of Chicago, who had showed up in Europe without the years of professional military training that the German soldier had received, without the deep institutional military culture that the Wehrmacht had inherited from the Prussian tradition, without the particular brand of iron discipline that the German military system had been producing for generations. And he made an argument that was and remains, 8 decades later, one of the most important and least fully appreciated arguments about the nature of American military power in the Second World War. He told the German general that the Wehrmacht had spent 12 years building soldiers. The Nazi state had taken German boys at 14 and put them in the Hitler Youth and spent the next decade turning them into military instruments through a process of physical conditioning and ideological indoctrination and technical training that was, from a purely mechanical standpoint, extraordinarily effective. By the time a German soldier reached the front in 1939 or 1940 or 1941, he was a highly trained, highly motivated, institutionally supported fighting man operating within a military system that had been optimized over generations for exactly that purpose. The American soldier, Patton told him, had none of that. The American soldier in 1942 or 1943 was a civilian. He was a guy who 6 months earlier had been working in a factory or going to college or farming his family's land or selling insurance. He had been taken from that civilian life, given a rifle and a few months of basic training, shipped across an ocean to a continent most of him had never seen, and asked to fight one of the most professional military forces in the history of the world. And then Patton said the thing that has resonated through military history writing about the American soldier in World War II ever since. The thing that cut right to the bone of what made the American military effort not just sufficient, but genuinely, historically, extraordinary. He said that what made the American soldier remarkable was not what he had been given before the war. It was what he figured out during it. He said that the American soldier was the fastest learner in the history of modern warfare, that the gap between the performance of American forces in their first major engagement, the disaster at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, where green American troops had been badly mauled by Rommel's veterans, in a way that temporarily seemed to confirm every European assumption about American military unreadiness and their performance 2 years later. Crossing the Rhine and driving into the heart of Germany represented a rate of institutional and individual military learning that was without parallel in the war. He said that the American military had gone from Kasserine to the Rhine in 2 years. 2 years of learning, adapting, improving, incorporating the lessons of each engagement into the next, with a speed and a flexibility that reflected something fundamental about the American character, the same restless, problem-solving, improvisational quality that had built the industrial machine that was simultaneously equipping the Soviet Union and supplying the British Empire, and the largest military force in American history, all at the same time, without the American economy collapsing under the weight of it. He said that the Wehrmacht had been built to fight the war it expected. The American military had been built to figure out whatever war it actually got, and in a conflict that had confounded the expectations of every military planner on every side from the very first days. The army that could figure things out fastest was, in the end, the army that won. The German general was quiet for a long moment after this. Not the quiet of a man who has been silenced by force, the quiet of a man who is processing something that has arrived with enough precision and enough genuine content that it cannot simply be dismissed. But Patton was not finished. Because there was one more thing, one more piece of the argument that he had been building toward from the very beginning of this conversation, the piece that transcended operational statistics and military analysis and cut directly to the personal, to the specific, individual, man-to-man level of the challenge that had been issued when that German general had looked across the table and declared the Americans to be the junior varsity. Patton leaned forward until he was close enough that the German general could not look anywhere except directly into those pale, cold, completely serious eyes. And he asked him quietly, in the same controlled, precise voice he had been using throughout a question that was not really a question. He asked the German general where his army was right now. He let that sit in the air for a second, and then he asked where the Third Army was. And the answer to both of those questions, the answer that the German general could not dispute, could not reframe, could not wrap in the language of Eastern Front mythology, or professional military honor, or the self-serving narrative of a defeated officer corps trying to preserve its self-respect in the wreckage of everything it had built and lost, was sitting in the room like a physical presence. The German general's army was gone, surrendered, destroyed, captured, scattered. The formations that had once stretched across the map of Europe from the English Channel to the suburbs of Moscow existed now only as names in the casualty records and the prisoner of war lists. The Third Army was here, still intact, still organized, still supplied, still commanded, still ready, a fully functional, battle-hardened, operationally sophisticated military force that had driven from Normandy to the heart of Germany and arrived in better fighting shape than many armies begin campaigns. That was the answer. That was the whole answer. And it was delivered not with triumph, not with the cheap satisfaction of a man rubbing a defeated enemy's face in his defeat, but with the flat, unanswerable factuality of a military professional making the final point in an argument that had just been concluded. The German general did not respond. There was nothing to say that the situation itself had not already said more eloquently than any words could manage. And the room, the American officers, the interpreters, everyone who had been sitting in that charged, crackling atmosphere for the preceding hour, exhaled. Collectively, almost simultaneously, like a pressure valve releasing. But here is the thing, here is the part that I need you to carry out of this video, and into the comments, and into your own thinking about this story. Patton's demolition of that German general's argument was not just a moment of personal satisfaction or national pride. Satisfying as it was on both of those levels, it was something historically significant. Because the argument that a German general was making in that room in 1945 did not die in that room. It survived. It grew. It became, in the decades of the Cold War and beyond, a persistent thread in military historical writing and popular historical understanding, the argument that the Eastern Front was the real war, that the American contribution was secondary, that without the Soviet sacrifice the Western Allied effort would have been insufficient to defeat Nazi Germany. And that argument contains, as Patton acknowledged directly and honestly in that room, genuine truth. The Eastern Front was larger. The Soviet sacrifices were incomprehensible in their scale. The Red Army's contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany was enormous and essential, and should never be minimized or forgotten. But the argument also contains, as Patton demonstrated in that room, a systematic and self-serving distortion that erases or diminishes the American contribution in ways that the historical record simply does not support. The American industrial output that kept the Soviet Union fighting. The American military campaigns that forced Germany to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, draining resources and attention and irreplaceable military strength from the Eastern theater. The American generalship that, whatever its flaws and limitations, produced one of the most rapid and sustained armored advances in the history of mechanized warfare. The American soldier, who went from Kasserine to the Rhine in 2 years and arrived at the end of that journey a fundamentally different and fundamentally better fighting man than the one who had started it. All of that is real. All of that matters. All of that deserves to be in the accounting when history renders its verdict on what the Second World War was and how it was won. Patton knew it. He said it in that room, to that German general, with the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life preparing for exactly this argument. and who was not going to let the last word belong to a defeated enemy's mythology, rather than the documented truth of what American soldiers had actually accomplished. And that right there is why this story matters. Not just military history, not just as the biography of a remarkable man in a remarkable moment, but as a reminder, a pointed, specific, historically grounded reminder that the American military contribution to the Second World War was not a supporting role, not a late arrival, not a junior varsity effort that rode the Soviet coattails to victory. It was essential. It was extraordinary. And the men who carried it out, the kids from Kansas and Ohio and Alabama and Brooklyn, who went from civilians to combat veterans in the space of a few months, and then drove all the way to the heart of Nazi Germany, deserve to have that truth told clearly, honestly, and without apology. Drop that in the comments. Tell me what you think. Tell me whether you think Patton got it right, whether you think the debate about the Eastern Front versus the Western Front is one that can ever be fully resolved, whether you think American military history gets the respect it deserves in the broader telling of World War II. Because I genuinely want to know. And if this story hits you the way I think it did, if you are sitting there right now with that feeling of something important having been said and heard and understood, share this video. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it. Because these are the stories that matter. These are the men and the moments that built the world we are living in. And on this channel we tell them straight every single week. No filler. No fluff. Just the truth. All of it. Let's go.